English paper piecing is a simple traditional craft that requires very few tools really. All you need is maybe a glue pen for basting, but you don't have to have that, some needles for sewing, scissors, thread, some paper shapes and some fabric. As well as the tools and materials being very simple, the techniques are simple too. It involves simply cutting and wrapping fabric around your shapes to baste them, and then simply sewing them together with a whip stitch. And then when you've done that, all you'll need to do is remove your paper afterwards. And the simplicity of it is one of the reasons why I really love this craft. It makes it accessible to so many people, and it's very calming and therapeutic to do. And today's video has very kindly been sponsored by Serious Readers, who make a wonderful range of serious lights, and I'll tell you more about that later on. In this video, I'm going to share some tips that can help to improve your technique with English paper piecing, if that's something that you're interested in doing. But I want to make it really clear that this video isn't saying there is a right and wrong way to do things, because I actually really believe that the best way to do things is the way that feels natural and comfortable to you. There really is no place for quilt police around here, but I often get questions asking me about certain things and people sending me photographs unhappy with their work, so I hope that this video will really help to address those points. I'm going to share it from the point of view of sharing the mistakes and things that I've learned along the way during my journey with this craft. I'm going to show you some pieces from the past and show you what was wrong with them and how I've fixed it now that I know a little bit more. We were all beginners once, and I am certainly still learning. So if you'd like to see some of the mistakes I've made in the past and how I've improved things a little bit, keep watching. Because there are two main techniques in English paper piecing, I'm going to split the video into two parts. The first one all about basting and the second one about stitching. So I'm going to cover as many of the tips and tricks and techniques that I can within those two categories. So let's begin with basting. Basting really is the foundation of English paper piecing, so any mistakes or things that go wrong at this stage can really have an impact on your project later on. Let's start by talking about paper shapes. It's really important that your paper shapes are accurately cut. If you buy them from a company that cuts them themselves, then they will be really accurate. We measure our paper shapes by the length of each side. So for example, this hexagon is a 1-inch hexagon because each side measures 1 inch. Now if you print out your shapes yourself and cut them out, then there is a real chance that they may not be all completely identical to each other, just through human error, if you cut them out with scissors, for example. So do bear that in mind. It is so important that your shapes are all identical to each other when it comes to fitting them together so that they all tessellate perfectly. Even just being a tiny amount out on each one will mean that your seams don't line up properly. Now there are two main techniques for basting the fabric around your paper shapes: thread basting and glue basting. Now I don't thread baste at all, I only use glue, so that's the technique that I'm going to talk about today. It's really important to use exactly the right amount of glue, and this really does come with trial and error. If you use the Soline glue pen, then you really don't need to use too much glue at all. You just need a thin line so that you can see it glue on your shape. Not too thick, but not too thin either. If you don't put enough glue on, you'll find that over time, particularly if you live in a hot climate, the glue will dry up and the fabric will pop off your shape. But equally, if you use too much glue and if you put it on too thickly, when it comes to removing the paper afterwards, it can make that job really difficult. But a top tip is to use an iron. Press your piece with a little bit of steam, because the glue is water soluble and will come out really easily. But do try not to use too much. The next thing that is really important is to not put the glue too close to the edge, and this is something that I used to do when I first started with English paper piecing, was to put the glue right up to the edge. Now what this does is when you want to sew your shape together, it causes your needle to be passing through that glue as you're stitching it together. That causes friction on the needle, which then can make it difficult to do. You're pulling and tugging, but also it can cause stress on your hands and hurt, and if you're using a cotton thread, it can cause it to break. So do leave 1/8 of an inch or so just away from the edge before you put your glue, and if you've cut your seam allowance big enough, then that won't be a problem. The next mistake that I used to make a lot in the past was folding the fabric over too tightly, and this is a really good example of it here with this star. These diamonds have been basted so tightly that there is no space between the fabric and paper. It's pulled over really tightly. And whilst that gives you a really nice looking shape, when it comes to sewing them together, it becomes really difficult. There's just no space whatsoever between the paper and the fabric, which means that inevitably your needle is going to end up going through the paper. And this is what a paper looks like when it's been removed, that has been stitched into all the way around. You can see those tiny little perforation marks. So here I'm showing you how I'm just wrapping it a little tiny bit more loosely. We don't want it to be too loose, otherwise we won't see the shape. But by just adding that tiny little bit of room in the fold, it means that the needle will fit through really easily and you're not going to hit that paper. The next thing that I want to mention is seam allowance. Now we typically use 1/4 of an inch seam allowance for our shapes. You can go a little bit larger if you wish, but I want to point out a reason why it's really important not to make it too narrow, particularly if you're basting a shape that has points such as a diamond. Now this is something that would frequently happen to me because I was always trying to use up every little scrap, and I still do, but it's really important that when you're doing your diamond shapes you allow more room at the top. Can you see how the paper is only a fraction away from the edge of the fabric there? And if you're using up scraps and you're trying to use every little bit and get really close to the edge, that can really cause a problem. You can see I can fold over the fabric fine on those straight edges, but the problem happens when you get to the point because of the angle of the point. The fabric actually isn't wide enough to overlap, and therefore the point isn't covered by the fabric at all. This will become a problem when you stitch it together and you'll have gaps and it just won't look right. This is an example of one where the seam allowance is absolutely fine. It doesn't need to be perfect, it doesn't need to be accurate, but it just needs to be big enough. Now with diamonds you get a dog-ear flap at the tip of the diamond, and that's important. You do need that flap for making sure that they all line up together. And you can see here the flaps on the back of this piece, but they are really important, otherwise you would get holes in the front, but because of those flaps all the points line up really nicely. This video has very kindly been sponsored by Serious Readers. Serious Readers are a British company, and here in the UK they make a fantastic range of lights that are brilliant for reading but also for crafting. I've been using the high definition model from the Serious Lights range for about a year now, and I absolutely love it. One of the great features of the light is that you can really adjust how bright or how dim it is depending on what you're doing. So if I'm watching something on YouTube, for example, I can just dim the light a little bit so I get less glare on the screen, but I can also still see my sewing. It's really good that you can position the light to any angle that you want, and you can also focus the beam of the light. You can adjust it so that it is wider and covers a wider space where you're crafting and sewing, or you can really focus it down and make it really concentrated on what you're working on, depending on what your needs are and what you're doing. There's a link in the description box below if you'd like to find out more about the Serious Readers lights, and if you use the offer code EMMA22 you'll get this free compact light as well as free international shipping. And this light is brilliant, and it's become a firm favourite with my son because he got a shadow puppet theatre for Christmas, so he's been using that light every single day and he absolutely loves it. A huge thank you to Serious Readers for sponsoring this video. Let's move on to talking about stitching. Now, when it comes to stitching, there are two main things to consider: the thread you're using and the needle you're using. Now, when it comes to needle choice, I think it's important to think about the size of the needle and the type of the needle rather than the brand of the needle. So I recommend using something that's a size 9, 10 or 11 milliner's needle. This one's a size 8 and it is just that bit too big. It's quite thick and will poke holes in the fabric that might be difficult to get rid of, might damage the fabric. But something that's a size 9, 10 or 11 will be great. You can choose a milliner's needle or an applique needle like these ones, which are a bit shorter. It is really personal preference. There can be a tendency for people to think that one brand is better than another and that the expensive needles are best, but I actually think that whatever brand you've got access to will be absolutely fine. The main consideration is the size of the needle and the type of needle and what feels good to you. In the past I've used needles that are too thick and they do cause holes, so choose something thinner. Next, let's consider thread. We need to think about the material that the thread is made from, the colour of the thread and the thickness of the thread. Those things are going to make the difference. So if you choose a cotton thread, it's a natural fibre and it is going to stand proud a little bit. It's going to be a bit more visible, particularly if you choose a sort of medium weight thread like that 50 weight thread. If you choose polyester in a fine weight like this one, it's going to sink into the fabric more. And this one, this Invisiville thread, is 100 weight. It's very, very fine and barely visible. That comes down to personal preference. I used to always use the Aurifil 80 weight cotton thread, and you can see here I'd almost finished this spool. This was my second spool of it. Everything that I did in the past was with this thread. And I really like this thread, but I've learned that it isn't, for me personally, not the best for English paper piecing, and I don't really use it anymore. You can see that the threads do show up on my quilt here, but also because it's so fine, as it goes back and forth across the paper, it does tend to snap as well really frequently. I think it's a great thread for applique though, but you can see here where I've used it in lots of places on this quilt. And I like the look of hand stitching and seeing the threads, but some people don't. And on this hexagon sewing case, I used polyester and you can barely see the stitches. So if that's the look you're going for, you may prefer polyester. Now, once you've chosen your thread and your needle, we now need to think about how we actually do our stitching. And one of the things that I used to do wrong in the past, as you can see here, I've got lots of examples of this, is not pulling the thread tight enough. And what that means is afterwards, when you've removed the papers, you can see large gaps between the shapes. I haven't pulled the stitches tight enough to create a really secure seam, so that then presents lots of weak spots in my projects. When the stitches are pulled tightly, you can see here there is no gap between those shapes whatsoever. They are stitched together really securely, but in other parts where it's too loose, it's just really weak and could easily fall apart. Another reason for these weak seams is not having enough stitches in. You don't want too many, but equally you need to have enough to make the seam really secure. And this was one of the first pieces that I did, and there are weak spots all over this piece, and it's not just that they're too loosely sewn, but it is that the gap between the stitches is far too big, and that's another thing. You need to make sure that your stitches are about 1/8 of an inch between each other. You don't need them touching each other, they don't need to be that close together, but they do need to be close enough so that you won't get this gaping in between. So how do we overcome this then? So the first thing is that we need to choose our correct needle, we need to choose the thread that we are comfortable with, choose a colour that blends with your fabric. So if it's a dark fabric, choose a dark thread, like in this example. And then we need to make sure we are stitching by pulling our stitches quite tightly and keeping them close together. If you do this, then you won't get those weak spots like I've just previously shown. Another problem that I used to get in the past was the centre of shapes that had points. So for example, the centre of diamond stars. And I've taught myself a good trick to overcome this, and that is to make your star by doing it in 2 halves. I used to join the diamonds together going around, and that would always leave the seams being really off and you'd get a hole in the centre. So the best thing to do is to make it in 2 halves, join 3 diamonds together, join another 3 diamonds together, and then line them up, and you can really line up your seams and your points and start stitching from the centre point. Don't start stitching from the outer edge. Stitching them together in this way really helps to line everything up and eliminate the chance of getting a hole in the centre. Another mistake that I made in the past was not securing my thread at every junction, at every intersection, every beginning and end of each seam. If you just do that little locking knot at each section, then it really secures the piece and will stop anything unravelling. It really is worth doing, and I learnt that the hard way. And another thing that I always like to do is to try and sew with a continuous thread and just carry the thread along the seam allowance to get to my next point, rather than fastening it off, cutting it and starting again. Obviously there are some points when you do have to do that, but whenever I can carry the thread along the back of a piece and it won't get in the way, I always do that, because I think the least amount of times that the thread is broken, the stronger the stitching will be, and it will give it more integrity. So that's it for this video. I hope it's been useful and that I've managed to share some tips that will be helpful to you, particularly if you're new to English paper piecing. If you'd like to see any more videos from me, then I'd love it if you would subscribe, and if you could give this video a thumbs up, that really helps me out. And if you have any ideas for more videos on tips, for example maybe tools and notions that are useful, then do let me know in the comments below. Or if you have any tips for English paper piecing that I've missed, then please put them in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Take care and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.